Hello, everyone, and welcome to GitHub in my day job. We're back for episode 2, and we have with us a very special guest. Donovan, I am absolutely ecstatic to have you here today. This is a great honor. So thank you for joining us.
No, it's perfect timing, right? You got me right at the last minute, right? Because this could be one of the last times I do anything like this as I'm retiring here soon. So no, I'm really glad to go out with a bang and be able to have this conversation with you today.
Really excited to have you here. So for everyone watching, this is episode 2. You can tweet us, hashtag us at GHDJ. I can't even say it. GitHub in my day job. This will be available to watch afterwards, but Donovan's going to talk us through some amazing stuff today, and I'll let him introduce the topic. But please feel free to ask questions, throw down some comments. Donovan has said nothing is off the table but what we're going to talk about today. And again, like you said, this could be the last time we get to interact with Donovan. So I'm expecting some good questions from everyone out there.
Yeah, please make it interactive. It's more fun for everyone that way. So I can talk for an hour. We don't want that. We want me to be engaging with you for an hour. When April reached out to me, there was this thing asking me, so what type of technology from GitHub do you use in your daily life? And obviously I used the repositories, but that wasn't what popped into my head. I am an enormous fan of Codespaces. I don't think that I could be a bigger fan of that particular piece of technology. It changed the way that I code every day, and it even changes how I present. And what I mean by that is, if you know me, I speak a lot at Microsoft conferences and conferences around the world, and I'm constantly having to prepare demos. And the setup and the teardown is just such an arduous task. But the easier that you can make that on a presenter, the more often they can rehearse, and the better the final product's going to be. And I went to Ignite last year, and I did a session on Dapr. I work for the Azure Incubations team, and Dapr came out of our organization. So I'm a big fan of it. Not to mention, I just think it's awesome tech because it makes writing microservices so much easier. But when you want to go demo that, there's lots of components and lots of building blocks, and setting up each individual demo can sometimes be a bit of a time suck. But what I did instead is I actually created a code space, and I can actually show you that on my screen. There's a repository inside of GitHub called My Dapr Demos. And what I would do is I would go in and just keep adding demos to this particular repository. And because I was using Codespaces in the back end, I was able to make sure that it fired up with all the tools that I needed. It had Helm, it had kubectl, it had Docker, it had Kubernetes, it had Dapr obviously on there. I was doing Twitter demos, and everything that I needed would just fire up ready to rock and roll. And I could just jump from workspace to workspace inside of that particular repository and do whatever demo it is that I wanted to do, knowing that it was going to work every single time. Whenever you're preparing for a big demo, you have to do the demo, and then you have to tear everything back down and get the machine right back to where it was. And if you forget any step of your cleanup, there's a chance that your demo won't go as you expect when you run it again. It's a very nerve-wracking process. I would always script it out, right? I would always write scripts, or I'd write a pipeline that would go and clean up all my resources in Azure for me. I would find some way to automate that process. And what was really cool is using Codespaces, that reduced drastically the amount of cleanup I had to do, because I knew my environment would be perfect. And I still run a PowerShell script or two that would go off and use the Azure CLI to go clean up my resources in Azure. But what I needed on my dev machine was always perfect. Being able to fire it up on anyone's machine, we've all been there. Again, thinking as a presenter, I've gotten places and lost my laptop, or my laptop was damaged. I had to use someone else's machine. And because Codespaces spins up in the browser, I can literally borrow anyone's machine that has a web browser on it and be able to do my entire demo without having to worry about, do they have the right tools installed or the right versions installed on their machine for me to be able to do my demo. You got a browser, I can do the demo you want me to do right now. I'm just going to log into GitHub, start my Codespace, and let's go have some fun together.
So and this happened to me in real life 2 weeks ago, actually. I was in London at a talk, and my laptop would not work. It had some voodoo in it. I literally grabbed a colleague's machine, spun up and did my whole demo, and it didn't stop me. And that's exactly—
It's unbelievable. The way it just makes me feel better and like more relaxed, and just, I'm like, man, I know this is going to work. And I can go up there right now and just do this demo over and over again. And because it was so easy to clean up, I rehearsed even more and more and more, because it doesn't take me 20 minutes to tear down a 15-minute demo, right? Because sometimes the cleanup is longer than the rehearsal. But because it's just, let's start over again, I rehearsed I'll actually show you the session. You can actually go back and watch it. So at Ignite, oh man, it's a lot of laughs. So this will be the last time that I ever presented at Ignite. I did this demo on Dapr, and the entire thing is done inside of a code space. There's two things that are cool about that. One is it was perfect because I had the security of Codespace. The other thing is I can share that with anyone who wants to do a Dapr demo. You don't have to be Donovan. Like, you can just go to that repository, start up a Codespace, and do every one of the demos that's in there, just like you or me. And I have a friend of mine who's doing that right now. And what's really cool is he's actually upgrading it for me, because the Twitter demo that I did, the Twitter component has been deprecated. So now I can have friends of mine go into my repository, contribute an update, and now we all benefit from this ability to go do these demos for our customers, for partners, or for potential users of this particular technology by sharing this repository and having an environment spun up for us all the time. So I could talk all day about Codespaces and how it's helped me. And the other thing that I did with Codespaces, which was really interesting, is not just from a demo perspective, but from how I do my job, and specifically onboarding. As an employee of a company, if you've been there the longest, you're probably going to be onboarding a lot of people at that company. And what onboarding includes is someone's new to the organization, and they need to get their machine set up. They need to get the source code on their machine. They need to get all the libraries and dependencies set up so that they can start compiling and building your application and having making a contribution. And unfortunately, the most senior people on the organizations get pulled from their day job and paired with a new person just to make sure that all of the details are ironed out to get that person to being productive. And that is, it's necessary, but it feels like a waste of time, right? Because I really want that engineer off doing things that I need them to be doing, especially the most senior engineers on my team. And the junior people, I just want them to hit the ground running as fast as possible. And Codespaces enables you to do that. Onboarding is no longer, let's go get your machine and install this tool and install that tool and download these packages and download these dependencies and set that up right. Oh, I forgot to tell you, you got to go do this thing over here, or go read this document in a wiki that explains exactly how to set everything up. Onboarding is now click this link, right? And you're ready to rock and roll. Let's go get you being productive very quickly. So it saves time from the new person, because everything they need is ready to go. And it stops us from distracting the more senior engineers from having been able to do their job as they're off helping people get onboarded. And one of the places where I did this myself was with Web3. Mm-hmm. While I was at Microsoft, Web3 was something I was spending a lot of time getting to know. We have an internal forum at Microsoft where we were talking about the future of Web3. And when I started working on it, I realized that getting truffle and ganache and everything set up on your machine can be tough, because you don't know if I want to use truffle or hard hat or foundry or brownie, or what tool sets do I want. And then some of them collide, and some of them want different versions of Solidity installed. And I realized that just setting up a machine so that you can go off and write your first smart contract was an arduous task. And at one point I started doubting, like, man, why is this so hard? Is it just because I don't understand Web3? Like, no, but it's just development. I've been writing software for almost 30 years. This should not be this difficult for me to set up a machine. This is ridiculous. And again, I went over to Codespaces and said, let me go and figure out everything I have to do to set up all three of the most popular frameworks for Web3 development and put them inside of an image that I can now spin up and not have that exact same. I think that's over here as well. So if you go to the Web3 workspace that I have in GitHub as well, this is an empty workspace, but it has all the tools that you need. So if you scroll down, you start to see that Brownie and Ganache are in there, Geeth is in there, I have Python, NPM, Yarn, like all the tools that you need are already installed, and the right versions that I know aren't going to conflict with each other and that are all going to play nice to each other. So if you're interested in getting started with Web3, you can simply click on this, fire up a Codespace, and just start following whatever tutorial that you're going to want to follow for the framework that you like. And this stuff is just going to work because it's already been vetted and confirms that those versions all work together. Now, I did this a long time ago, so I probably need to go back in there and update some of these. But anyone can do that because it's in GitHub. They can send me a pull request and say, hey, Donovan, I updated Hard Hat for you, or I updated Foundry for you. And now this image is just as good as it was before, but with the latest and greatest bits, so people can go off and get started. So when you fire up a Codespace and you're inside Visual Studio Code, and then all of a sudden Copilot starts helping you write the code that you need, like we say this all the time and it almost starts to feel cliche, but it's true. Like every day we wake up, it's the best day to be a developer, because we at Microsoft are just adding, and GitHub together, just adding so much stuff that makes my life as a developer so much easier than it used to be. People keep saying, man, you're retiring. Are you going to get bored? Bored? I'm going to be coding the day I retire, right? And I'm going to be using all the stuff that I just showed you in retirement, having a blast. So I don't know how I could possibly get bored when there's so many toys to play with. I already started a static web app with Blazor, so I can go figure out, because I haven't played with Blazor a lot yet, right? But that's exactly what I'm going to be doing my first day of retirement, is writing an application in Blazor just to have some fun with it. So yeah, I could go on and on and on about how cool Codespaces is, but it was like single-handedly my favorite feature of GitHub for sure.
It's been you've nailed it. You know, when you're onboarding someone new into a project, your machine breaks, and also the thing of it doesn't work. It worked on my machine, or it doesn't work on my machine. And I have an argument now. For those of you watching, I used to be a Microsoft employee. I now work for GitHub. And as a Microsoft employee, I always worked on a Surface. And when I joined GitHub, they gave me a Mac. I have 2 Surfaces in my office and a Mac, and I can go between any 3 devices because it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter if your team is running Linux, Mac, or Windows devices. Anyone can write their code. They get started quickly. It takes out all those barriers to entry as well, especially as a junior developer or even a seasoned developer. And you said it, you're going to retire. You just want to write code. Like if it takes you like 3 days or a week to get set up with all the right versions, you're going to tap out, Donovan. You're going to be like, you know what? I'm going to go sit by the pool and read a book. I'm going to go race my car. Anything other than spend 4 days finding my versions.
No, for sure, 100%. I couldn't agree more. It just has to be easy, and it's so easy with Codespaces that I'm excited. And I was again biggest fan of Codespaces you're going to find is probably me.
We have a question from the audience. Someone asking about running demos on Gitpod. Now, I have an opinion on Gitpod. Have you ever used Gitpod?
I have not. Once I find something, I'm just like everyone else. I don't like change. Once I found something that worked for me and worked really well, I just stuck with it. But that might be something I need to go off, and I'll put that on a list of things to go research. But I haven't. I've been using Codespaces because, I don't know much about Gitpod, but Codespaces is giving me my full fidelity of Visual Studio Code on my machine, but I'm running in that environment. Meant all my keyboard shortcuts worked, all my extensions were already installed. And another thing that I kept using Codespaces for is I'm obviously a DevOps guy. I build pipelines all the time. And at the core of Codespaces is a Docker image. Well, what I would do is I would use that exact Docker image that I was using in my Codespace in my pipeline, which meant when I needed to go build something, I knew that it was going to build on my CI/CD pipeline the exact same way it built locally, because I'm using the exact same image. So I can tell my pipeline of choice, hey, use this image, clone the code into that image, and start building it because I know all the tools in that image are correct. Exactly. And at that point, it was just like, oh my gosh, like there's no limit to the ways that I can use this image to be able to use it for my local development. I can use it for demos. I can use it in my CI/CD pipeline. And what I'm going to get is that consistent behavior across all the different ways that I'm actually interacting with the source code that I'm actually building.
Absolutely. And I think I have used Gitpod in the past. I used it for a demo with another vendor to do infrastructure as code. I thought it was really heavy, if I'm honest with you. So I have used it. I didn't like it. It also caused some really weird flaky issues, but Codespaces is built into GitHub. It's there. It's easy. And you're right. It gives me the VS Code experience across the board, and it's secure. So when we work with customers and organizations, because we both talk to customers, like we can talk about Web3, we can talk about DevOps. They want to talk security, and security is built into Codespaces. So that absolutely kind of nails that conversation, to the head. Someone had a question about merge conflicts. Now, we could totally go out on a tangent about merge conflicts, Donovan. But do you want to address how you usually handle merge conflicts?
Yeah, even I use my Codespaces as I would my local development machine, which means I'm going to be dealing with short-lived feature branches, right? You can actually pull and leverage whatever branches inside of your pipeline, inside of your Codespace. You're not tied to the branch that you actually created the Codespace from. Once the Codespace is up and running, you can create a brand new branch. You can go off and do some short-term development and then merge that back into your main branch or whatever branch you created that branch from. So don't think of it as this Codespace is tied to the branch in which I created it from, and all my work has to be done there. And good branching strategy has absolutely nothing to do with Codespaces. I want to be very clear about that, right? You knowing how to do branching correctly and having short-lived feature branches and being able to do forward and backwards integrations to make sure that your branches don't shift too far, so that you don't have those merge bombs, because merge bombs are bad. But merge bombs existed before Codespaces, right? As soon as we were able to create a branch, anyone who had a branch that lived for too long and deviated from their source branch for too long is going to have a merge conflict and potentially a merge bomb, which is where it takes so long to merge the changes, you almost want to start over again. But I don't want you to think that Codespaces and somehow encourages bad behavior when it comes to branching. Are you going to have merge conflicts? 100%. You're going to have it with or without Codespaces. So just treat your Codespace as this environment where I can still go do the right thing, right? And I can use the right branching strategies, and I can have short-lived feature branches that are going to mitigate the chances of us having a merge conflict, so that I can then merge back into my source branch faster and be able to go back in and mitigate that chance. But are you going to have them? 100%. And it doesn't matter if you use Codespaces or not. That's a problem that an engineer has to be thinking about.
Yeah. And I love just hearing you talk about short-lived feature branches, because it's something that is still a fundamental thing that we haven't solved in the DevOps problem. I actually spoke to someone about this recently at an event, actually it was a couple weeks ago, about policies. Like, people don't think to enact policies. And I'm like, it's built into GitHub. It's built into Azure DevOps. Most CI/CD tooling has policies for your branching. They're like, oh, I never thought of that. And it doesn't mitigate every problem, but it starts mitigating a lot of the problems that you have.
Yeah, you want to automate as much as you possibly can, because that's just less burden on the engineers, right? I want my unit test to automatically run. I want there to be a build to run every single time I try to do a pull request, right? I don't want to have to remember to have run a build. I don't want to have to remember to have run all the unit tests, because we don't, right? We run the unit test around the piece of code that we're actually focusing on. And I have the assumption now as an engineer, as long as I've been doing it, that my CI/CD is going to protect me, right? So I don't even think sometimes to run all of the unit tests, because I know that if something bad happens, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to get an email or an alert saying, Donovan, you broke the build. And no one's going to be affected by that, because my PR actually went and ran the build and said, Donovan, it's good or it's not good. And then I'll go back in and I'll make the corrections that I need to go back and correct. Even on the Azure DevOps team, when Azure DevOps builds Azure DevOps, the number of unit tests that it runs increases as you get closer to production, right? Because we want to make sure the developer knows right away everything looks good, but as we start to go, we run more and more and more unit tests, right? And your CI/CD system is supposed to be protecting you from that. Also, there's clever rules where you can say, if someone touches this area of the code or this folder structure, like Donovan has to be an approver, right? Because Donovan is the owner of that particular branch of code for whatever reason. Maybe there's some security audits in there, or there's something else that I need to make sure that I look at. So those policies are extremely powerful to make sure that you're baking in the best practices, and you're going to make sure that your code has the best chance of reaching production with the fewest issues and concerns in the code. So by all means, leverage the tools to the best of their ability. CI/CD isn't just about compiling your code and shipping your code. It's about security scans. It's about like making sure that you run linters and run all your unit tests and your functional tests. It can do so much for you. And what I've noticed is as people mature across their DevOps pipeline, I see their pipelines doing more and more for them. You can do unbreakable pipelines, which is something that we partner with Dynatrace on, where we actually codified the metrics that we want to be monitored as the code moves through its pipeline. And as we deploy it to a QA environment or a staging environment, and we start to run these batteries of unit tests and stress tests, we're watching metrics that were actually pushed into the pipeline. And if those metrics change, the pipeline will roll back or stop your particular deployment for you. Like, how cool is that, to where I don't have to push it to production and then watch data after it's been pushed to production to realize that we've made a mistake. I can say, if the CPU usage ever goes above this particular threshold, as you're moving from QA to staging into production, I need you to stop this because we've obviously made a horrible error. So think about your pipelines as a way for you to go and automate as much as you possibly can. And the policy is a great way to do that for sure.
Yeah, and I actually just worked with the Azure load testing team on doing this in pipelines. We did it actually with GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps as well, integrated into your pipeline, beginning to end, and it's fantastic. You don't have to wait till the production. You don't have to break production anymore. It's a whole new thing. We had a question from some in the audience about why we don't have Codespaces for GitHub Enterprise on-prem. The reason is Codespaces runs in the cloud. It runs on Azure. It is a containerized environment that spins up. So when you go and spin up your Codespace, it's sitting in the cloud. It's not available on-prem. You can create environments in which to work from, but it's not Codespaces. So it's a whole different ballgame. It's a basically software as a service in the cloud, if that makes sense. Secure packaged environment. So that's why it's not available for GitHub Enterprise on-prem. And there's a lot of other things on-prem when you go GitHub Enterprise that just aren't there with security and some of the tooling because it's not a live cloud service. You're not getting that live feedback, et cetera.
So I'll give you something that I've done, and you might still be able to do as well, that I was able to leverage the same base image that I use in Codespaces locally. And the way that I did that is, if you have Docker for desktop on your Mac or on your Windows, or you're just running Docker on your Linux machine, I was able to build the Web3 image that I built in such a way that it played happily with Codespaces. And that was the best experience, because when you're using Codespaces, you're able to tell it inside of the config file what extensions you want installed inside of your Visual Studio Code instance automatically. So when you fired up doing Codespaces, everything fired up and then all your extensions were installed. There's a folder structure that dictates where things need to be. Well, that folder structure luckily does not overlap with what Docker Desktop is expecting. So what I was able to do was create an image that worked in Codespaces, take that exact same image, put different files in different folders, and then be able to run that exact same image in Docker Desktop. So it's not as good of an experience because Docker Desktop doesn't automatically install any extensions. But if you create the right file in the right folder, when Visual Studio Code fires up, it sees like, oh, there's recommended extensions. Do you want me to go install these for you? And you can just say yes, 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 yes. And all of a sudden, all these extensions get installed. So I was able to take that same concept, right? It was like Codespaces opened my mind to the fact that I was never utilizing Docker locally to its fullest extent. I know what Docker is. I'll spin up SQL servers when I need them really quickly, and I would do a little bit of dev, but I wasn't thinking about an entire dev environment as I was introduced to in Codespaces locally. But it opened my eyes to the fact that you can get around some of those things to where I need that local, for whatever reason, experience, or I can't use Codespaces in this particular environment, but I want to build my image in such a way that I can leverage it in both places. That is actually possible. It takes a lot more, I shouldn't say a lot more work. I just had to learn more about
more setup time.
Yeah, exactly, because like building that image becomes a little bit more complicated, right? Because you're having to put files in certain areas. You're having to use your Docker file actually access two different users while it's being built. So there's a little bit of a finesse that goes into building that image, but it's totally possible. And I felt it was definitely worth the investment, because once I had that image and I could move it around and again, use it in my build, use it locally in Docker Desktop, or use it in Codespaces was really valuable for me.
Yeah, when I worked in engineering at Microsoft, every single project we built with Docker Desktop, we containerized everything.
Right.
Every project had a dev container. And I will say this to the day I die. Every project, every GitHub repository should have a dev container built into it. So you can spin up a code space. So you can spin up locally, because same thing with having GitHub Enterprise on-prem, or, previously Codespaces wasn't a thing. But now that's a thing. It's a thing. Buy it, use it. It's awesome. But before it was a thing, we built everything with Docker Desktop, and then Docker Desktop changed their licensing mechanism. So this is great for Codespaces. But yeah, every single project we did when I was in engineering involved Docker Desktop and building everything locally in Devcontainer so that anyone could utilize it. All the tools were there. So there have been a couple questions come in as well. Someone asked about Codespaces being hosted available in India. Within the India geography boundary. Not yet. That is coming. Vinod, we do have a public roadmap for when and where it's available. I don't know the date offhand. The GitHub public roadmap is available if you just go into your favorite search engine. If you can't find it, ping me after and I can send it through to you. And then asking, does Codespaces run containers? It runs on a container. I can't see the person's name. But yes, does it run containers? So you can do full cloud native development within a code space. Yes.
Correct. Yeah. So because that question is a funny question, because it can be asked like, is it run in a container, or can I run additional containers from within my code space? And the answer is yes to both of those, right? So whichever way you were trying to answer that, the question is yes, because when I do my Dapr demos, Dapr spins up other containers, and they're all running inside of my code space that I can then go back in and use. For example, my Zipkin or my Redis cache or whatever it is that I'm using is actually running inside of another image spun up inside of Kubernetes, right? Well, it's inside of my code space, I mean. So whatever way you meant that question, the answer is yes.
Yes and yes. Yeah, exactly. And also the person that asked which region. So thank you, Dave Bernison, for pointing out the current region for Codespaces are Europe West, US East, US West, and Southeast Asia. So they are spun up in Azure data centers. There are more coming down the pipeline. If you want to see them in your region, send in the request. The more requests that engineering gets for this, the more priority that gets, definitely. Someone asked if Codespaces was discontinued in 2021. No. So GitHub Codespaces used to be called Visual Studio Codespaces. And it was renamed, rebranded, all that other good stuff. So now it's owned by GitHub, but sits on Azure. And that's the Microsoft and GitHub together story that we don't talk about enough, but it's definitely there.
Yeah, it was called Visual Studio Online, actually, because I remember giving that demo at Ignite, and I made a joke about its name because we had something already called Visual Studio Online years ago, which is now called Azure DevOps. And then we went back and used the exact same name, and it like finally made sense because it was a full dev environment in the cloud. And then when we finally had the perfect name for the perfect product, we took it away and named it something else. And like Microsoft loves to screw up names. We finally had one that was freaking perfect, and we decided, yeah, let's call it something else anyway. I'm like,
every time we have a great naming and then they destroy it.
That's crazy.
Every time. And I always tell people, like, I'm never in charge of naming. That's not my job. I just have to sit here and show you all the cool things about it. But every time we change a name, I just cringe and I'm like, here we go again. Smile and nod. It's going to be fine.
Yeah.
It's going to be fine. We did have a question about Codespaces and working with database-based applications. Have you worked with database-based applications, Donovan?
Oh, for sure. So what I normally do is the majority of my resources that I'm leveraging are going to be inside of Azure, right? So my Codespace is really where I'm going to be coding. It's going to be where I'm running Visual Studio Code. It's going to be where I'm doing all of my debugging. But I normally am provisioning resources that are inside of Azure. What's really cool about Codespaces as well is that you can actually configure all of the security that you need ahead of time. For example, your service principals, or however you're going to log into Azure CLI. So what's really cool is when I spin up one of my Codespaces, I'm logged in to everywhere. So I have my Azure CLIs already logged in and pointing at the right Azure subscription. I'm logged into Docker Hub if I'm going to be pushing the Docker Hub. I put all my passwords with that repository, assign them to that Codespace, and when I fire them up, I have access to all those passwords inside of my startup script. And what my startup script does is it starts logging me into all these things that I need to be logged into. That Dapr demo works against AWS, it works against Google, and it works against Azure, which meant I had to log into all three of those CLIs to make sure I could reach everything. And I needed special passwords for my Twitter stuff. I didn't have to set those up every single time. I didn't have to go remember what those passwords were and put them inside of my image. I set them up once, associated it with that particular Codespace, and when it fired up, all that magic just happened. Reason that I'm saying that is that I would then write a PowerShell script. And by the way, PowerShell works on Mac, Windows, and Linux, right? So I know there's some Bash people out there, and PowerShell's better. And I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack about that, but it freaking simply is. So what I did is I would simply write inside of a Docker image, which is a Linux machine, PowerShell scripts that would then be able to use the data that was stored in there by GitHub inside of my Codespace to log into Azure. So when I run my PowerShell script that says, go create me a SQL Server database or a Cosmos DB database or MySQL inside of Azure, it would just automatically happen for me. And I was already authenticated against Azure, and then I would just do my local development because all my connection strings, again, using PowerShell, I was able to not only provision the thing that I needed, but then go back in and query the connection string and scribble it into a file that I needed on my local machine so that I could leverage that information when I was doing my development. So my world became run a PowerShell script, provision all of the database resources or even any external resources. I use cognitive services, or I'll use some other type of Microsoft service in Azure. Those would all be provisioned for me. But inside of Codespaces, I now have access to all those things. And then I would be able to do my local development. That being said, because you can actually run other Docker images inside of your Codespace, you could spin up a MongoDB. You could spin up a local SQL server running inside of a container. So whatever data you needed, as long as there's an image that can be run or a resource that can be provisioned in some cloud provider, just provision that information, that infrastructure, and then just use it in your day-to-day coding. So I've done both of them. If you look at the Dapr demo that I did at Ignite, that video, all that stuff is provisioned inside of Azure. But I'm doing all of my development out of a Codespace. But locally here at my house, I use SQL Server inside of containers all the time, right? Because I don't want to install the full SQL Server on my machine and maintain it and patch it all the time. So whenever I need a SQL Server, I just spin it up into a container and I connect to it right from my machine, which I could also do from a Codespace.
And for everyone out there watching, we have Donovan's GitHub repo with the demo he's speaking about. So you can deploy it to Azure, AWS, and GCP. It's all good to go. And the README is really stinking good. So you can get started pretty quickly, follow the directions. I love a good README. It's so simple, but it's like, oh, I know what I'm doing. It's great.
Yeah, a lot of people skip that. And one other thing that you said earlier I wanted to double click on is like every repo should have a dev container. I contribute a lot to open source. And I just feel better and I smile when I go to a repo that I'm going to contribute to, and there's one of those already. I'm like, cool, code space, I'm ready to go. A great README is fantastic. A README that I don't have to read because everything just freaking works is even better, right? Because so many times I've gone through and my first PRs to a lot of people's repos is fixing the README because it's out of date or it doesn't work or I had to go do some other step that you forgot. So you'll see a lot of times my first few pull requests are fixing your README because if you follow it, I can't get this thing running. I can't get it actually working. But when there's a dev container, the README should say start code spaces. Perfect. Let's go. Like, let me go ahead and start getting productive and helping you contribute. Because just like you said earlier, April, when I go to try to contribute to a repository and I struggle for more than like 10 or 15 minutes, I just don't want to fix that anymore, right? It's like not that important to me. I'll go find somewhere else because the on-ramp to contributing to your repository is so difficult and so painful that it's just not worth it. Because if I can't even get it started, I can't imagine the state of the code that I'm gonna go in there and try to fix because I can't even get this thing going, right? So having an on-ramp to contributing to a repository as easy as Codespaces, I believe is going to encourage more people to contribute because getting started is going to be so much easier.
And when I work a lot with the IT pro community. And there you go. Why GitHub? Why Codespaces? So when I'm getting someone started into using Git and GitHub, a Codespace is such an easy way. And I had this issue recently. I was teaching a group of people how to use Git. And then I realized from the Codespace, because it's just like VS Code, all the extensions are in there for pull requests. And I'm like, we're going to type that. No, we're not going to type this in anymore. It's a little bit of ClickOps, but it helps someone onboard so much faster into a project when it's hosted in GitHub, especially someone that doesn't use Git every day. It is such a great way to get started. But you're right. Yeah, I don't want to spend 3-4 days figuring out how to get started on your project. Just kills me. Life's too short for that. Someone asked a question about what advice do you have for working offline in Codespaces? We kind of talked about that, right? So that's building everything in Docker desktop and doing it that way. I love that you use PowerShell and everything. You've probably heard my PowerShell stories. Both Abel and Jeffrey Snover in the same day, but I will always use PowerShell, and it is such a powerful tool to automate everything that I'm doing. And it was working in an engineering team. I had a manager that was so open sourced, and he worked for Microsoft. His laptop was Linux. Everything was an open source tool for him, and we had this great, I call it the come to Jesus moment, but head to head about PowerShell. He was always talking about like Linux people versus Windows people versus Mac people. And I'm like, that story's mute, man. I'm like, it is all about cross-platform. And then I started showing PowerShell. And then all of a sudden I transformed an entire team of Mac and Linux folks into using PowerShell in our pipelines and everything we do. And they're like, this is so much easier than Bash. And I'm like, yes.
I've had those same debates with people. Jessica Dean and I went for about an hour. Right, because she was diehard Bash, diehard. You know how like she's just so, and I'm just as stubborn, right? So like we're both leaning in and like, no, you just like it's so much easier to read. Like it's just so much easier to read. Like when you're looking at the commands in Bash, if you don't know what those acronyms mean, you're done. Right? Because you don't even know how to look up the tool that you're trying to use because it's so arcane and so cryptic. But then when PowerShell, some of the names are verbose. Of course, you can create an alias after you're comfortable with it, but it like just reads to you. Like this is what you're doing. You're getting the contents of a file. You're like, it's like, dude, come on. And the fact that you can easily write your own and extend it, and matter of fact, if you, again, that demo that I did at Ignite, I talk about Bash versus PowerShell. And it was funny because I'm making all these jokes and some people are very, very serious about their Bash. I was getting flamed on Twitter afterwards. Like people were like so mad at me for what I was saying. But then if you look at some of the stuff I'm doing at the command line, I don't know how you do that in Bash. Like even just simple navigation around my file structure. I was able to jump to areas where I'm not CDing my life away. Or I'm literally saying jump to, I know there's a file that has this word in it. And next thing you know, I'm in the folder with that file in it. And all I did is type JT and I'm ready to go, right? So there's things that I've added to PowerShell because it's so easy to write your own modules. And once I started working on Linux, I was like, I don't understand why I would ever go back. So I learned Bash for a while. As soon as PowerShell worked on Linux, I was like, there's no going back for me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a game changer for me. And that's totally like off the cuff of everything we've been talking about. But I will walk into any project and start talking about PowerShell every single time, especially in the cloud, automating things, especially in Azure, maintaining state, doing all sorts of great things in my pipelines. It's just easy and it's so intuitive. And the folks that spent their time for years writing PowerShell. If you know C#, you know PowerShell effectively.
That's true. That's a good way of thinking about it as well. Everything that you can do there, you can do in PowerShell.
And actually, that's how I learned C#. Well, that's how I really got into C#. Was I was like, oh, I know PowerShell, and I'm like, oh, duh, it's C# in the back end. Okay, I can figure this out.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to traverse things. So if you guys are looking to automate all your pipelines, all the things, do PowerShell. Donovan said it. Fire your angry tweets at him. No.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, it's such a I love the discussion about it. Sorry, I had to like divulge a little bit. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about GitHub Copilot. The reason why I want to talk about Copilot is because life is hard. Things are hard. Let's not make things more difficult for ourselves. And we want to talk about developer enablement, writing code, again, getting started faster. Talk to us about your experience with Copilot.
It has been, it's almost like it's magic is the only way I can describe it. And the level of increased productivity, even when you're learning something brand new, like the time it was the freakiest experience for me was I was trying to learn something new. I was following a tutorial. So I have multiple screens. I have the tutorial on one screen. I have my editor in front of me, and Copilot is running. I start typing. I'm looking over my shoulder and I'm typing in the lines, and I glance over my peripheral vision and I can see that Copilot is like suggesting, and it's the exact line that I'm on. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. So I hit tab, and then it suggests the next line, and I look over. It's the exact next line, like character for character, and even the variable name's like, that's weird. And I keep hitting tab, and it's like they're looking over my shoulder at the other screen and helping me type everything in. And I was just like, it was the freakiest experience, was when it's able to almost be reading the same code that you're reading in the tutorial and helping you type that in was fantastic. One of the other things that I really like about Copilot is that it encourages a really good behavior, and that behavior is writing better comments. As a developer, we are notorious of not writing comments. We write the code, we get it to work, and we leave, and we have convinced ourselves that the function name that I chose, the variable names that I chose, the way that I wrote this is so elegant and so beautiful that it just speaks to me as a developer. And years from now, I will read this and come back and think, oh my goodness, this was the best code I've ever written. A week goes by, there's a bug in it, and I have no idea why I chose any of these stupid names or what this even function is supposed to be doing. I don't know if it's broken or if that's exactly what the function is supposed to be doing, because in that zone, in that moment, I thought it was gorgeous code. But a week from now, I don't remember why I wrote it. The reason I harp on comments is because the first thing I have to do when I go back to legacy code, and I still moonlight for software I wrote when I was 24 years old, so that's 25 years ago almost, or 26 years ago now, and I go and look at a block of code, and the first thing I have to do is write a comment at the top for my next future version of me looking at this code, explaining to myself, what does this code actually do? Copilot can, first of all, write the comment for you on existing code, which is kind of freaky, right? But what it also encourages me to do now as a developer is write my intent as a comment before I write a single line of the function or method or anything, and then see Copilot write the method for me. And it's like 90% exactly what I wanted. And now I have this comment that I will be able to leverage when I come back to this code to modify, to enhance, or to fix, knowing exactly what I was trying to do when I wrote this code originally, versus it basically being a function with no comments, me thinking that it's the best code I've ever written. So using Copilot, not only to help me learn something new faster, because it's almost as if it's helping me with the tutorial that I'm doing, but encouraging me to write better comments on what it is that I'm trying to do. And I almost make it a game. Like, how well can I write this comment to where the code generated is exactly what I want it to be? Because if I've done that, that comment's probably really, really good, and it's going to stand the test of time when I come back to this code. And I didn't have to write any of this code myself. This code is actually written for me, and it's going to be using a lot of the best practices that Copilot's been able to glean from all the code that's been written. So to me, it's about encouraging best practices and speeding me up. And it's just like the coolest experience to see it start to suggest things and be right. And even when I am following a tutorial, but I change the name of a variable because that variable means more to me, and then I tab, and it's like, okay, I know where you were in that tutorial, but I see that you changed the variable name, and like the next line is still right. Right? It's like, come on, man. Like the context that it understands, it's been able to help me write unit testing. It's just fantastic.
I love that it helps you write tests, because that's something I think a lot of engineers struggle with. The other thing I really love about it, now I'm an American, I live in England. Now, for those of you that know British English. The British use an S instead of a Z, or Z as they call it, and they put OU in everything. So I was on a project and one of the guys spelled something with an S instead of a Z or a Z. And he spent 4 hours trying to figure out what the heck he did. And that language barrier for him caught him out. And it's interesting because I live effectively in Europe, and I work with people that write code all day, but English is their second language. And I commend them because I speak terrible English and I grew up in the language, and they're literally coding in it. And Copilot has allowed them to translate it to English and not have to worry about that language barrier. And then the other way for you and I, like I speak zero Spanish.
Right.
And I was with Roselle Scarlett, who's another GitHubber, and she was able to code completely in Spanish. And I'm like, yeah, I'm tapping out. Like that takes out that language barrier that we have. You can work with literally anyone in the world and helps the language bit. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the other things I noticed about it, not only does it speed me up because it's able to anticipate what I want, it speeds me up because I no longer have to have that context switch out of my editor to a search engine, Stack Overflow, wherever it is that I have to go to get the answers to the questions that I'm having. You can ask the question in a comment in your code and then have the answer brought to you inside of your editor. I've always been a big proponent of reducing the context switches of your developers. The reason that I loved Azure DevOps for so long is because inside of Visual Studio, not only did I have my code and my source control, but my work items as well, the results of my build. So I didn't have to leave an alt tab to something else before I was able to get the data that I needed. Because every time you alt tab out of one an application into another, you might see that you have some unread emails, and that'll distract you and you'll go read those emails. And the next thing you know, it's been an hour before you go back to the editor and realize, oh crap, I was supposed to go search for this answer. So let me alt tab out of that, and then boom, someone pings you some here, and next thing you know, like that single context switch has lost you hours of productivity. But if I could have kept you focused inside of your editor, then you wouldn't have seen that email, which really didn't need to be addressed right now. But because it had your manager's name on it, you freaked out and you went and you got distracted, and all of a sudden you're just losing your productivity. Having Copilot be able to infer and answer questions for me inside of my editor reduces the number of context switches I need to make in a day to be able to achieve my goals, which makes me more productive. Even if it didn't suggest like the right code, which it does, if it just answered the questions that I had, it would make me more productive because I don't have to go to Stack Overflow and scroll down and try to find the one with the most answers and copy and paste the first one, which didn't work. And then you scroll down further and there's a better answer. And it's just like, Stack Overflow, an amazing tool, but I don't miss not having to go there. You know what I mean?
And I've actually started using ChatGPT and Copilot, and I've been using both to kind of compare and contrast. So I always think of Copilot as my pair programmer using AI. It helps me write that code. ChatGPT also helps me generate code, but I find both are pretty literal, especially ChatGPT. So I've kind of compared and contrasted. So if I'm going net new with something, or like I would have gone to Stack Overflow, I go to ChatGPT, it spits out an answer. And I'm like, okay, cool, it gave me something, but you have to be super literal. So like PowerShell scripts. Yeah, I want to do this. Oh, it didn't include this thing. Like I had it export out my Azure resources one day, really simple with the date. When was the last time I logged into this resource? It didn't list the resource group. So I had to tell ChatGPT, hey, do that for me. And then when I'm actually writing code, Copilot comes in and helps me write that better code without question. But you do need some knowledge. So there's been some questions about Copilot. So next week, we are going to have a deep dive on Copilot with a gentleman named Tug. I hope that I pronounced that properly. So you guys can sign up here. We're going to go a deeper dive. I'm actually not going to be there. My awesome counterpart, Christopher Harrison, is going to be there. He's going to be doing that episode. But in terms of Copilot, you know, people are asking like, what kind of question, what's going to be in 10 years? I don't know. I mean, you look at 10 years ago, none of this stuff was here, right? 10 years ago, cloud was still in its infancy in so many ways. I actually started working in Azure in 2013. That was the first time I started working on it. So I'm not even going to predict anything for 10 years because I think we're just going to start multiplying our advancements each year.
The way that it's able to infer, and it's almost take information that it's learned in one discipline and apply it to another. That's where it's starting to get really, really powerful. But from what I understand, and I might have to register for the one for next time because I'm kind of curious. From what I understand, Copilot has combed over all the code inside of GitHub to learn what it understands. But we're going to we always create new languages. We create new languages because they're specific for solving a particular type of problem. And I'm curious of when will we get to the point to where Copilot won't need a repository of existing code to be able to infer the right thing to do. It's almost like it needs to be able to read the spec of the language, not sample code of the language. Because if the body of code has to already exist for Copilot to then learn from, there's still going to be a space for engineers like myself who are dying to go play with the next language that doesn't have sample code written for it, who had to go read the spec to understand how to best architect code using that. And I think we're going to be the generation of developers who are producing the data set that Copilot's going to go learn from, right? So I think being a really good developer and being a developer that doesn't 100% rely on those tools is still going to be a very valuable trait 10 years from now, because we're going to keep creating languages for specific tasks that no one has written code for yet, right? When Python first came out, like there was no Python code until someone started writing that code and defining what those best practices were and making that code public so that things could then learn from things, being ourselves, AI, whatever, from that particular body of work. And I've always been that kind of developer. There's still going to be engineers out there who are always going to be looking for what's new, what's next, what language can I go write that solves this specific problem. So even 10 years from now, I think there's still going to be a place for not only the engineers who understand OpenAI and that technology well enough to help guide it to the right answers, but also those of us who are just trailblazers who are working in languages that there's no data set for that language yet.
And absolutely, even for the existing data sets that are there, it's not, Copilot is not perfect. It, when I've used it, it spits out some amazing stuff. But if you're going net new, it doesn't always spit out maybe the way you'd write it or a human would write it. So it's still learning. So it's training itself off the model. So someone asked a question, will it use the code, use their specific code? If your code is in a public repo, that's available for Copilot to train its code from. It's only pulling from public repositories. But it still has a lot of holes in it. We talked about PowerShell already. PowerShell has a specific problem in Copilot because it doesn't have models to train itself off of. And that's something the PowerShell team within Microsoft is trying to resolve. How do we get better models? So I think Copilot's going to improve, but we need humans to be the trailblazers, as you said, to really develop that. And I think, in 10 years, our jobs are going to be enhanced and everything is moving faster and faster. And there's going to be new jobs that come out of this.
I think to the question about does Copilot use my code, it does actually use your existing code in the file that you're in for context, right? It is smart enough to do that, right? So if you're going to write something very similar to something you've already written in the same file, I believe you're going to see some magic happen there, right? So it understands context, where when I change the variable name of a tutorial that I'm following, all the lines that it suggests after that have my new variable name in it in the right space, right? So it clearly understands contextual clues that are in the code that you're working on when it's making suggestions for you going forward. So again, I think there's a couple ways. I think you answered the question, but I think there's another way to interpret that question on, did you mean combing my repositories to learn how I code, or using context in the file that I'm in? And I know it uses context because I've seen it happen in myself.
Absolutely. And Dave Bernson brought up a really good point. GitHub calls it Copilot, not autopilot, for a reason. And we do call it your AI pair programmer. It is your rubber duck. It's your pair programmer. You're sitting in a room at 10 o'clock at night. Everyone's asleep because you're in a different time zone, or in my case, 5 a.m. Everyone's in bed. No one wants to touch their code. Turn on Copilot. It is my buddy, basically, when I'm writing my code.
We got mandated. So I work for Mark Razinovich, who's the CTO of Azure, and he mandated that every engineer have it running all the time. Like, because you just said something like turn it on. It's like, we're not allowed to turn it off, right? Like, it has to be running all the time. It's like, there's no downside to having another pair of eyes, even if they're AI eyes, looking at your code saying, yeah, here you go. Let's make you faster. Let's make you more efficient. Let me tell you that doesn't look right. Let me encourage you to write better unit tests. Let me help generate those unit tests, which developers are convinced that if they don't write unit tests, they're faster, which is a fallacy. And 1,000,000% wrong. You're actually a much faster developer when you write unit tests, because you're able to refactor at a much more aggressive rate, knowing that you've been protected. I won't get on my soapbox because we only have like 10 minutes left, but I am like, write freaking unit tests, right? If you're not writing unit tests, I just don't know what you're doing. Go earn your paycheck, go write those unit tests. They are crucially important. And I noticed that when I go back to a piece of code and I add unit test, I understand the code better because I wrote a test that I thought was going to fail and the freaking thing passed, or vice versa. I wrote a test that I knew was going to pass and it didn't. I'm like, what's going on? And I end up having to comb through that code and get really like into the details. Like, wow, now that I've written 5 more unit tests, I understand that code better, and I feel more confident being able to go back in and change it and enhance that particular code. And I know I'm not going to have a bug escape into production because I'm going to run these unit tests as part of my CI/CD pipeline. So for everyone, please write tests. Like even when I had to learn Go when I joined Mark's team because Dapr was written in Go, and that was getting ready to go to production when I joined the team. And the first thing I learned when I started firing up Go was how do I run a unit test? Not how do I write in the language, not how do I write hello world, but how do I write a unit test? How do I run my test in this particular new language? And when I figured that out, I would write my test and then start writing code to see if I can make those tests pass. And when I got into that mode of just always writing my test first or very shortly after I've written code, my code has just gotten better and there's no going back.
Absolutely. It's awesome for code optimization. I think someone in the audience has pointed that out as well. Old projects, pick up, make sure you have Copilot running on that repository in your VS Code or in your code space and rock it. Just fix old code. It's a awesome. Great thing to do. It's great practice. And yeah, write unit tests. I love your soapboxes, Donovan. They're always fun to listen to.
That's one that Abel and I would get on to get. If you had Abel and I in the same call and someone said they didn't write unit tests, we were done for 20 minutes. For 20 minutes, we were about to go complain at you for not writing unit tests because he and I, he was the fastest developer I'd ever met, and he wrote unit tests. And man, I worked a lot of projects with him, and I never found a bug in his code, and it drove me nuts. When something didn't work, it's like I finally got him, and then it was always my code. Always. And this guy was speaking brilliantly fast, but he and I both were adamant. You have to write unit tests.
Unit tests were always the first thing he spoke about every time. So we have 9 minutes left.
Okay.
For everyone watching, this could be Donovan's last ever event ever. He's going to retire. So while we let some questions come in, what are you going to do next? What's next for you?
I've been racing cars a lot. So I just got back from a 3-week road trip to Las Vegas where I have a Tesla Model 3 Performance that my wife and I race, full suspension and the whole 9 yards. So that's what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to be shopping I think I'm going to get a GMC Denali Ultimate. Because I tow right now with an X5 and it's mad at me. It's like, you just took me for 3 weeks towing a freaking 5,000-pound trailer. And it did fine, but it was obvious that it doesn't want to do this for a living. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to go buy a proper tow vehicle. And my wife and I are going to race cars. And I'm going to still be coding. Like I said, I have a Blazor project I just fired up at like 3 o'clock last night. 3 o'clock in the morning, I was up and I was like, what do I want to do? And next thing I know, I'm in Azure spinning up a Azure Static Web App and have a Blazor app on my desktop. So I'll be coding and I'll be racing cars. So if you follow me on Twitter or on Instagram, you're going to see a lot of car pictures and me on the road with my wife.
Awesome. Wow, I haven't seen any other questions coming. I'm waiting for the Donovan questions. For those of you watching that have questions about what's coming up on Copilot or any other GitHub technologies, githubnext.com is the website to go to. We put everything publicly available for you to see what's coming, get your teeth into, and without question, next week we're gonna go deep dive into Copilot with Tug, and I hope I pronounced that right. It's the hardest part of my job is pronouncing people's names.
Yeah, it's hard.
But yeah, too. So and just we're human, right? This is why we automate things. So you're gonna go race some cars. You're gonna do you can do any DevOps when you retire. You're gonna
I do DevOps in every project that I use, right? Like, how can you, if I intend to deploy something into Azure, how am I going to do that without a CI/CD pipeline, right? So that's definitely going to happen. The last blog series that I wrote was on Medium, was about building a DevOps pipeline for Web3 applications. I also wrote one for DevOps for .NET 6 when you're using minimum APIs and things like that. So I think you might find me more on Medium because I'll have more time to write and I will be able to go back in and write some of the things I want to do. Again, I still moonlight on a piece of software for pneumatic tube systems that I wrote when I was 24. And I'll spend a little bit more time on that type of software that I used to write. And I'll probably write some, I think, blog posts on WPF and Wix. Not Wix, the website creation thing, but Wix, the Windows installer, because the application that I write is actually a FAT client, WPF application that has to be installed with the Windows installer. And I realized that that's a skill that people are losing, the ability to write a proper installer and have it deploy your applications locally on a Windows machine. So I think I might go do some more blogging on that as well.
Awesome. So for those of you watching, this is a very long URL. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Medium, you could also just use your search engine and find Donovan. Yeah. He wrote an awesome blog about the DevOps pipeline for the Ethereum blockchain, which is pretty cool. The Web3 stuff is amazing. We didn't even touch on it today. I'm starting to look at Web3 for gaming. Some of the platforms that you can do with that is pretty cool. But yeah, so have a look at Web3, what Donovan's talking about. Follow him on Medium, and get his next blog. So I think, Donovan, we're probably going to wrap up now. For everyone watching, this has been amazing. And for everyone watching, join us next week for episode 3 with Tug and everything Copilot. AI, he'll probably talk about Copilot X with Christopher Harrison, and Christopher Harrison loves Copilot, so it's going to be an amazing show as well. So Donovan, it has been absolutely an honor to host you for potentially your last ever session. I'm happy that you're moving on to amazing things, but I'm sad that you are leaving, because selfishly I've learned a ton from you. Everyone in the world has learned everything DevOps from you. And I think someone said it on your Twitter one day, was like, DevOps was born the day you were born. Like, it was just came out of the womb with DevOps, you know. It's been amazing. So I absolutely appreciate having you on the show today and talking about Codespaces, Copilot, and all the amazing stuff you're doing. So
thank you so much. No, I appreciate you having me, and thanks for the kind words. And I you never know, maybe I pop back up, or there's going to be software, there's going to be DevOps and everything that I do, even in retirement. So I'm sure you'll see me somewhere.
I think you're going to blow some tires in your car and realize I maybe do a little bit of work on the side, just a little bit for the racing tires. So awesome, Donovan.
All right,
thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you all next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.